Today, I am discussing about the most important chapter of science class 10th, from which minimum 2 say 4 questions are asked in every exam, so it is most important. So let's start without wasting of time. Chapter number is 8. Chapter name is Heredity, Anuvanshikta. Let's start. We have seen that reproductive process give rise to new individuals that are similar but subtly different. We have discussed how some amount of variation is produced even during a sexual reproduction, and the number of successful variations are maximized by the process of sexual reproduction. Next, if we observe a field of sugarcane, we find very little variation among the individual plant, but in a number of animals, including human beings, which reproduce sexually, quite distinct variation are visible among different individuals. क्या कहता है यहाँ पे? इफ़ वी ऑब्जर्व अ फील्ड, यदि हम किसी भी फील्ड को ऑब्जर्व करते हैं ऑफ शुगर कैन जो गन्ना होता है उसका, वी फाइंड वेरी लिटिल वेरिएशन, हम कुछ ही वेरिएशन को क्या करते हैं, देख पाते हैं एमंग द इंडिविजुअल प्लांट, सभी प्लांट के अलग अलग जो इंडिविजुअल होते हैं अलग अलग, उसके बीच हम क्या करते हैं, सम ही वेरिएशन देख पाते हैं. बट इन अ नंबर ऑफ एनिमल including human being which reproduce sexually, quite distinct variation are visible among different individual. लेकिन क्या होता है, इन अ नंबर ऑफ एनिमल, यदि कोई भी जंतु की बात की जाए, इंक्लूडिंग ह्यूमन बीइंग, यदि हम ह्यूमन बीइंग को, आदमी को भी यदि हम इंक्लूड करते हैं, बीइंग which reproduce sexually, क्विट डिस्टिंक्ट वेरिएशन आर विजिबल एमंग डिफरेंट इंडिविजुअल. तो इसमें क्या होता है, सभी इंडिविजुअल जो है व्यक्ति हैं, सभी में बहुत सारे डिस्टिंक्ट वेरिएशन दिखने को मिलता है. गॉट इट? इन दिस चैप्टर वी शैल द स्टडी द mechanism by which variation are created and inherited. Okay. Next, accumulation of variation during reproduction. Inheritance from the previous generation provides both a common basic body design and subtle change in it for the next generation. Now, think about what would happen when this new generation in its turn reproduces. The second generation will have differences that they inherit from the first generation, as well as newly created differences. Got it? Next, figure 8.1 would represent the situation if a single individual reproduces, as happens in a sexual reproduction. If one bacterium divides and then the resultant two bacteria divide again, the 4 individual bacteria generated would be very similar. There would be only very minor differences between them generated due to a small inaccuracies in DNA copying. However, if sexual reproduction is involved, even greater diversity will be generated, as we will see when we discuss the rules of inheritance. Okay. Next, do all these variations in a species have equal chance of surviving in the environment in which they find themselves? Obviously not. Depending on the nature of variation, different individual would have. Here, figure 8.1 creation of diversity over succeeding generation, the original organism at the top will give rise to, say, two individuals similar in body design but with subtle differences. Each of them in turn will give rise to two individuals in the next generation. Each of the four individuals in the bottom row will be different from each other, while some of these differences will be unique, other will be inherited from their respective parents who were different from each other. Okay, got it? Next, different kind of advantage. Bacteria that can withstand heat will survive better in a heat wave. As we have discussed earlier, selection of variants by environment factors forms the basis for evolution process, as we will discuss in later section. Got it? Now we will discuss about heredity. The most obvious outcome of the reproductive process still remain the generation of individual of similar design. The rules of heredity determine the process by which trait and characteristic are reliable inherited. Let us take a closer look at these rules. क्या कहता है heredity? The most obvious outcome, okay, of the reproductive process still remain the generation of individual of similar design. Okay, the rules of heredity determine the process by which trait and characteristics are reliable inherited. Got it? Next, inherited traits. What exactly do we mean by similarities and differences? We know that a child bears all the basic features of a human being. However, it does not look exactly like its parent, and human population show a great deal of variation. Activity 8.1. Observe the years of all the students in the class. Prepare a list of students having free or attached ear lobes and calculate the percentage of students having each. Figure 8.2. Find out about the ear lobes of the parent of each student in the class. Correlate the earlobe type of each student with that of their parents. Based on this evidence, suggest a possible rule for the inheritance earlobe types. Got it? Next, rules for the inheritance of trait. Mendel is contribution. The rules for inheritance of such trait in human being are related to the fact that both the father and the mother contribute practically equal amount of genetic material to the child. This means that each trait can be influenced by both paternal and maternal DNA. Thus, for each trait, there will be two versions in each child. What will then the trait seen in the child be what? Mendel Seebox worked out the main rules of such inheritance, and it is interesting to look at some his experiment from more than a century ago. Got it? Figure 8.2. A. Free and B. Attached ear lobes. The lowest part of the ear, called the earlobe, is closely attached to the side of the head in some of us and not in others. Free and attached earlobes are two variants found in human population. Next, Gregor Johann Mendel. Gregor Johann Mendel, 1822 to 1884. Mendel was educated in a monastery and went on to study science and mathematics at the University of Vienna. Failure in the examination for a teaching certificate did not suppress his zeal for scientific quest. He went back to his monastery and started growing peas. Many others had studied the inheritance of traits in peas and other organisms earlier, but Mendel blended his knowledge of science and mathematics and was the first one to keep count of individuals exhibiting a particular trait in each generation. This helped him to arrive at the law of inheritance. Got it? Next, Mendel used a number of contrasting visual characters of garden pea, round and wrinkled seed, tall short plant, white या violet flower and so on. He took pea plant with different characteristics, a tall plant and a short plant, produced progeny by crossing them, and calculated the percentage of tall or short progeny. Got it? In the first place, there were no halfway characteristics in this first generation of F1 progeny. No medium height plant, all plants were tall. This meant that only one of the parental traits was seen, not some mixture of the two. So the next question was, where the tall plant in the F1 generation exactly the same as the tall plant of the parent generation? What? Mendelian experiment test this by getting both the parental plant and these F1 tall plant to reproduce by self-pollination. The progeny of the parental plant are, of course, all tall. However, the second generation or F2 progeny of the F1 tall plant are not all tall. Instead, 1/4 of them are short. This indicates that both the tallness and shortness trait were inherited in the F1 plant, but only the tallness trait was expressed. Okay, next. This led Mendel to propose that two copies of factor no called genes controlling trait are present in sexually reproducing organism. These two may be identical or may be different depending on the parentage. A pattern of inheritance can be worked out with this assumption. Activity 8.2. In figure 8.3, what experiment would be do to confirm that F2 generation did in fact have a 1:2:1 ratio of capital T, capital T small t and small t trait combination? What? In this explanation, both capital T and capital T small t are tall plant, while only small t is a short plant. In other words, a single copy of capital T is enough to make the plant tall, while both copies have to be small t for the plant to be short. Trait like capital T are called dominant trait, while those that behave like small t are called recessive trait. Work out which trait would be considered dominant and which one recessive in figure 8.4. Got it? Next, what happens when P plant showing two different characteristics rather than just one are bred with each other? What do the progeny of a tall plant with round seed and a short plant with wrinkled seed look like? What? They are all tall and have round seeds. Tallness and round seeds are thus dominant trait. But what happens when these F1 progeny are used to generate F2 progeny by self-pollination? What? A Mendelian experiment will find that some F2 progeny are tall plant with round seeds and some were short plant with wrinkled seed. However, there would also be some F2 progeny that showed new combination. Some of them would be tall but have wrinkled seed, while others would be short but have round seed. Okay, next, you can see as to how new combination of the trait are formed in F2 offspring. When factors controlling for seed shape and shade color recombine to form zygote leading to form F2 offspring. Figure 8.5. Thus, the tall and short trait and the round seed wrinkled seed trait are independently inherited. Got it? Next, we will discuss about how do these traits get expressed. What? How does the mechanism of heredity work? Cellular DNA is the information source for making protein in the cell. A section of DNA that provides information for one protein is called the gene for that protein. How do protein control the characteristic that we are discussing here? What? Let us talk the example of tallness as a characteristics. Okay. Next, we know that plants have hormones that can trigger growth. Plant height can thus depend on the amount of a particular plant hormone. The amount of the plant hormone made will depend on the efficiency of the process for making it. Consider now an enzyme that is important for this process. If this enzyme works efficiently, a lot of hormone will be made and the plant will be tall. Okay. Next, if the gene for that enzyme has an alteration that makes the enzyme less efficient, the amount of hormone will be less and the plant will be short. Thus, genes control characteristics of trait. Got it? Next, if the interpretation of Mendelian experiment we have been discussing are correct, then both parents must be contributing equally to the DNA of the progeny during sexual reproduction. We have discussed this tissue in the previous chapter. Okay. If both parents can help determine the trait in the progeny, both parents must be contributing a copy of the same gene. This means that each pea plant must have two sets of all genes, one inherited from each parent. For this mechanism to work, each germ cell must have only one gene set. Okay. Next, how do germ cells make a single set of genes from the normal to copy that all other cells in the body have? What if the progeny plant inherited a single whole gene set from each parent? Then the experiment explained in figure 8.5 cannot work. This is because the two characters capital R and capital Y would then be linked to each other and cannot be independently. Here, figure 8.4 ratio is mentioned here, 3:1, self-fertilization F1 cross-fertilization. Got it? Here figure 8.4. Okay. Next, figure 8.5 here defined it. Got it? Independent inheritance of two separate traits, shape and color of seed. Got it? Next, inherited this is explained by the fact that each gene set is present not as a single long thread of DNA but as separate independent pieces, each called a chromosome. Next, thus each cell will have two copies of each chromosome, one each from the male and female parent. Every germ cell will take one chromosome from each pair, and these may be of either maternal or paternal origin. When two germ cells combine, they will restore the normal number of chromosomes in the progeny, ensuring the stability of the DNA of the species. Such a mechanism of inheritance explains the result of the Mendel experiment and is used by all sexually reproducing organisms. Got it? But a sexually reproducing organism also follow similar rules of inheritance. Can we work out how their inheritance might work? Next, sex determination. We have discussed the idea that the two sexes participating in sexual reproduction must be somewhat different from each other for a number of reasons. How is the sex of a newborn individual determined? Okay. Different species use very different strategy. For this, some rely entirely on environment cues. Thus, in some animal like a few reptiles, the temperature at which fertilized eggs are kept determine whether the animal developing in the eggs will be male or female. Got it? Next, in other animals such as snails, individual can change sex, indicating that sex is not genetically determined. However, in human being, the sex of the individual is largely genetically determined. In other words, the genes inherited from our parents decide whether we will be boys or girls. But so far, we have assumed that similar gene sets are inherited from both parents. If that is the case, How can genetic inheritance determine sex? What? The explanation lies in the fact that all human chromosomes are not paired. Okay? Most human chromosomes have a maternal and paternal copy, and we have 22 such pair. But one pair called the sex chromosome is odd, is not always being a perfect pair. Women have a perfect pair of sex chromosome, both called X, but men have a mismatched pair in which one is a normal sized X while the other is a short one called Y. So, women are XX while men are XY. Got it? Next. Now can we work out what the inheritance pattern of X and Y will be? As figure 8.6 show, half the children will be boy and half will be girls. All children will inherit an X chromosome from their mothers, regardless of whether they are boys or girls. Thus, the sex of the children will be determined by what they inherit from their father. A child who inherits an X chromosome from her father will be a girl, and one who inherits a Y chromosome from him will be a boy. यहाँ पे बताया गया है कि जो मेल होते हैं और फीमेल होते हैं, फीमेल में जो होते हैं 23rd वाले जो क्रोमोसोम होते हैं वो क्या होते हैं, एक्स एक्स होते हैं फीमेल में, लेकिन मेल में क्या होते हैं, एक्स वाई होते हैं. गॉट इट? मेल फीमेल में एक्स एक्स, मेल में एक्स वाई. यदि गैमेट्स में एक्स और वाई मिले तो क्या होगा, मेल बच्चे जो होंगे मेल होंगे, बेबी बॉय होंगे. जब भी वही गैमेट्स में एक्स और एक्स होंगे तो बेबी जो होंगे क्या होंगे, फीमेल होंगे. गॉट इट? जो जायगोट का निर्माण होगा फीमेल में वो एक्स एक्स होगा, जो जायगोट का निर्माण होगा बॉय में वो क्या होगा, एक्स वाई. गॉट इट? यही बताया गया है. नेक्स्ट वी विल डिस्कस अबाउट व्हाट यू हैव लर्नड. वेरिएशन अराइजिंग ड्यूरिंग द प्रोसेस ऑफ reproduction can be inherited. These variation may lead to increased survival of the individual. Sexually reproducing individuals have two copies of genes for the same trait. If the copies are not identical, the trait that gets expressed is called the dominant trait and the other is called recessive trait. Got it? Next, trait is one individual may be inherited separately, giving rise to new combination of trait in the offspring of a sexually reproduction. Next, sex is determined by different factors in various species. In human being, the sex of the child depends on whether the paternal chromosome is X for girls and Y for boys. Got it? Hope you will learn something new. So friends, here is my end of my class. So thank you friends. Love you friends.